Welcome to Sunday Punch with Kelly and Radio Rahim. Sunday Punch is brought to you by Louisville Legends Gym in West Louisville, where the greatest trainer in the history of the city, Jimmy Doolin, trains some of the most promising, up-and-coming young fighters in the sport. Louisville, Kentucky is the home to 4 heavyweight champions in Marvin Hart, Jimmy Ellis, Greg Page, and of course the greatest, Muhammad Ali. Our audience has been requesting a boxing show for quite some time, and we are bringing that to you. We're going to discuss the big fights, the big fighters, and all the top stories. We have access to Max Boxing's, Radio Rahim's pre- and post-fight interviews, which will lead to some great discussion. A great way to find the interviews is to do a Facebook search for the first name Radio Rahim, last name being Max Boxing. Interviews ranging from Mike Tyson and Oscar De La Hoya to Bob Arum and Floyd Mayweather and everywhere in between. A big reason a lot of people have been calling for a show like this is the controversy and the questioning of, the emergence of maybe MMA and different sports and the relevance of boxing and where the sport is headed. Obviously, the networks are constantly trying to keep up and to keep their product marketable, and they're trying to do that through the use of technology, different types of things. What are ways, in your opinion, Rahim, that the industry can move forward in a way that is promising for the future of the sport?
Kelly, this is a question that we wrestle with as journalists and fans, fighters, promoters, all of us in the sport who care about the future of this sport are constantly wrestling with. How do we stay relevant? There's a myriad of different thought processes on what keeps boxing alive. It's been called dead, several times. We've gone through so many eras in boxing that you thought, hey, maybe this is the last hurrah. Maybe this time it really is finished. It's been a legacy of corruption, even at its inception. They're all the way back to Jack Johnson. We've dealt with the racist aspect of black fighters not being able to get championship fights, white fighters actually having a much different style and much different approach to the sport before it became something that everyone was able to participate in, just like the evolution of so many other major sports, except that because boxing has never been well regulated, it's never been streamlined, it's never been dominated by one entity that could look out for its best interests from day to day, from year to year, from so-called season to season. It's often fighting against itself, only in the way that it's structured. The promoters compete with each other. Now the networks compete with each other. Obviously, the fighters compete with each other. But everyone's looking out for their own best interests. And the question remains at every step, who's looking out for the interests of the sport as a whole? I don't think that you can really point to any particular entity, not only that's looking out for the sport, but that has the power to dominate the sport to a degree that it can make significant unilateral changes that are good for the sport. So what I've come to is a theory that we, the fans, we, the journalists, the fighters, those who buy the tickets, who really keep the sport alive by participating in these events, have to demand that the theory used by the networks who puts this fight in front of the world and the promoters who finds these fighters all over the world and presents them to the network as entities that can be sold have to demand competition that is not just thrilling and entertaining and exciting, but that is legitimately matched for the best possible outcome. And I think the theory that promoters have used through the years is that the best possible outcome is that the most lucrative or the most fan-favorited fighter be successful. And that's where the aspect of corruption comes into play always. Is it the building of a star, the guy who maybe comes out of the Olympics after having won a gold medal, already has a fan base. The guy from some country from whom only one star has emerged, so he's got a whole nation behind him, and to promote him and to keep him winning keeps a whole nation of fans tuning in. So that is inherently good for the sport. We have more fans. They're all on this one guy's back, so it's in our best interest for him to win. Is it the fighter who is nurtured by the promoter right out of the amateurs? He's got a phenomenal talent that's undeniable, but to put him in against other equally or close to equally talented fighters risks his ascension to superstardom. So all the way up the ranks, he avoids the tougher fights, and they showcase him with fighters that he is easily able to display this phenomenal talent. But we never find out until well into his career how well he would have done against his peer group or his contemporaries that are, if not equally talented, certainly competitively talented, which is why they avoid that competition all the way up the ladder. In my estimation, it's better that the fighters that have talent fight the fighters that have talent. They say styles make fights. Don't match up guys that are sluggers and come forward fighters with great chins against guys who don't have chins, who may be boxers but are easily dominated by pressure. This is how matchmakers think. I think matchmakers in that way are holding the sport back because there are so many options now, Kelly, with different sports you can tune into. There's 1,000 channels. Boxing's not the only combat sport anymore. You have to, and I think if any one thing can be pointed to that the UFC does right, it's that they show you the fights that you want to see when you want to see them. They don't build stars, they build events. And that's why most all of their events that are noteworthy are on pay-per-view, and people pay to see them. People go to the bar and see them. People spend money out of their pocket every couple weeks or so, it seems. They have a pay-per-view fight, and the fans never get tired of shelling out the cash because they know every single time they go there, they're going there to see a great matchup. And at its fundamental base, that's what boxing needs to adhere to. You know, I had to, when researching this topic, because it is so important, I decided that I would go to the heavyweights, figuratively, the heavyweights as those who commentate on and observe the sport, the professional observers. So I start out with a Hall of Famer. Where better to go than a man who's been sitting ringside for decades, seeing these fights firsthand, and is intricately involved in the business of not just presenting the fight to the fans, but interpreting and translating for the fans what he sees at ringside. So we're going to start with Jim Lampley in this clip. Gives much the same, I think, principles that I've laid out, but with his own tilt on it. And it's interesting to see how Jim perceives what I perceive. Check him out.
The sport ultimately honors the legacy of fighters who take the biggest risks. Who do you respect more? A Roy Jones, who went through the vast majority of his career unbeaten, but perceptibly against lesser opposition? Or Tommy Hearns, who lost most of his big fights, but took risk after risk after risk? I think in the mind of the public, the honor goes to a guy like Hearns.
Based on that clip, like you said, Jim Lampley, obviously a legend within the sport already. Someone like Floyd Mayweather, who, regardless of whether it merits the reputation, he is known for kind of cherry-picking who he fights. You know, Robert Guerrero, I would argue, is a formidable opponent for him. But over the years, obviously has a perfect record. Floyd does. Do you think that a fighter like Floyd Mayweather, who has, you know, you could say has avoided the tough fights, will go down in the history books more favorably? Or will someone like maybe Miguel Cotto, who came off his loss to Floyd, and instead of scheduling a cupcake, he scheduled a tough lefty in Austin Trout, who all of Cotto's advisors suggested he avoid him. It is almost a trap fight. He took it, he lost, and people still, at least I do, I'd like to still see Miguel Cotto fight again. Do you think the history books will look back on someone like Cotto as being a tougher fighter, and maybe Floyd Mayweather as being more of a guy who cherry picks who he fights?
No, I don't think that the history books are going to be quite written that way. And here's why. Floyd Mayweather, you can find people that say, oh, cherry picking, it's a pretty extreme term. It gives this sense that he's entirely avoided tough competition simply to showcase his talent. I think that he is an excellent mix of what we're discussing here. He came up in a way that was so attention grabbing with the skill set that he presented so early in his career that when he faced a challenge that we thought was big, that we thought was going to, you know, finally test him, he blew through those challenges so quickly, so easily it seemed. And the way he would put it is easy work with Diego Corrales. He was able to dominate a fighter that we thought might just step in there and knock this young, brash, arrogant boy out. And he went in there and displayed a kind of boxing skill that, hadn't been seen in quite some time. And throughout his career, he has challenged solid competition, but not when you want to see him. I would say Oscar De La Hoya is guilty of that. I would say that the fighters that exhibit a certain level of skill set and ability, fans want to see that showcase, but they want to see it showcased against the best at the time. And if Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, even after the Pacquiao knockout, even at this late date, I think that there's still enough energy for that fight to happen. For it not to have happened, as I've said in the past 2 or 3 years ago, it's a tarnish on both their legacies. It's the unknown. It's the idea that, at one point, half the boxing world would have picked Pacquiao and half the boxing world would have picked Mayweather. And for that question never to be answered, both of their legacies are tarnished. It's whether or not in the next 6 fights that Floyd has signed a fight, he says he's going to fight 30 more months. I think really almost as a fight goes, so goes his career. These are the championship rounds. Okay, you've proven that you can dominate. You've proven you can dominate people that we thought were going to be much more or tougher competition for you than they actually were when they stepped in the ring. I think because a Juan Manuel Marquez has faced Pacquiao and faced Manny Pacquiao and faced Floyd Mayweather, he's a good barometer. He was dominated by Mayweather. There was no need to see even a second fight, much less a third or a fourth. With Mayweather, he blew through that guy. Yet Pacquiao struggled with him significantly. We saw Cotto, who you mentioned, face Manny Pacquiao and face Floyd Mayweather. I would argue that Floyd Mayweather had a much tougher time with Cotto than Pacquiao. So in using those 2 examples, you can't really say which fighter is the toughest for each opponent based on the skill set of the individual fighter that has fought both fighters. It's again where styles make fights. Timing makes fights. Where a fighter is in their development at that time. So what Floyd has been able to do, I think, is fight fighters at a time when it's most advantageous for him. Well, right now, if he really wants to lay down a legacy of domination in the sport, as he calls himself the best to ever lace up some gloves, well, that is a pretty lofty crown to wear, and you can't place that on your own head. To do that, I think in the next 6 fights, he's got to show that he's willing at the end of his career to step in with the best, the brightest, the up-and-coming, and the established. So that's when history will be written. That's when we'll really find out Floyd's mettle. Easy work, he says, is made because he makes tough fights look easy. Well, now it's time to take the toughest fights out there. And you don't have to make them look easy, but if you can make them victories, I don't think he'll be able to be denied by history. There's an aspect of the sport that will never go away. An aspect of the sport that I think holds it back on the one hand, but often brings up that controversy, that constant debate that boxing thrives on. Like no one likes to debate more than boxing fans. But what they tend to be debating is decisions. When a fight goes the whole 12, a championship fight goes the whole 12, at that point, we have a situation where everyone has seen something, but no one has seen exactly the same thing, exactly the same way. And because this sport is not based on points that can be scored through a bucket and tallied throughout the fight without contest, or touchdowns that when you cross the line, you get the 7 points regardless of how you ran across that line or who hit you on the way, but by how you perceive a fighter having fought or against one opponent for 3 minutes and who prevailed and why you think that in that span of the 3 minutes, that particular fighter was more dominant or victorious over his opponent. There are no hard and fast set of rules as to how you score a boxing match. So there are tons of decisions that you'll find people on both sides of, and there is no clear and concise way to determine this guy won this fight by decision, and this guy lost this fight by decision because X, Y, and Z for sure. Not everyone is X, Y, and Z, but a lot of X, Ys, and Zs are composed of so many different things. I bring this up because bad decisions in boxing, the kind of decisions where a great majority of the fans or ringside observers think that it went one way and the judges seem to have seen something entirely different, is holding the sport of boxing back. Hey, I am one that has evolved from being a purist. I will admit that, earlier in my appreciation of the sport, I was very, very guarded about changing any aspect of it that took away from the history of what boxing is, the legacy of anything in the sport that has been established throughout the years. I would think to do something different, to bring technology into the sport, to bring in something like an instant replay, which is intended to be used in the Martinez fight on HBO, the upcoming Martinez fight. They're going to use instant replay, okay? I have sat ringside for countless fights, Kelly, countless fights. And one thing I have to do before I do a show like this, before I'll answer texts from my friends or get online and engage in any kind of debate, I got to go home and watch that fight on television. I can't decide at ringside immediately, unless the fight is incredibly one-sided, that I've seen everything that I need to see. On television, you see so much more. And ringside, you see so much differently. So only fans, I think, that have sat ringside for a number of fights and then taken the time to go home and rewatch the fight on television can appreciate how tough the job is of the judges. So, earlier in my appreciation of the sport, I would be far more critical of the judges' decisions and not appreciate how tough a job it really is to score a fight. What this sport needs is televised judges. And when I say televised, I don't mean you're watching them, that they're watching it on television. But they also need the ringside judges. I would like to see boxing being brought into the 24th century technologically. Let me, again, bring Jim Lampley into the conversation because, again, I posed this kind of question to him, being that he's had the experience of sitting ringside and doing what he does. I know he's have to have, gone back and watched these things on television. They've got a television screen right there ringside for a reason, so they can see the replay, so that they can see the intricate details that others can't see sitting ringside. Let's let Lampley in this clip lay that out for you.
Do you think that this sport of boxing, first of all, is being held down by some of these very controversial decisions going the wrong way? And do you think that is something that we can clean up and will clean up?
Well, the simple answer to your question is no, because in every subjective sport, and I don't care whether it's gymnastics, diving, biathlon, wherever there's something being judged subjectively, you're going to find irregularities, you're going to find preferences, you're going to find political differences, you're going to find things that are highly questionable. Questionable decisions are as old as the sport of boxing itself, of course. And every time one comes along, there's an enormous public tendency to say, oh my God, so many questionable decisions, they're ruining the sport. Simple fact of the matter is, it's not that easy a sport to judge.
What first thing that comes to my mind after that is I think of the June 9th fight from last year between Timothy Bradley and Manny Pacquiao. I watched it with a lot of my buddies, actually sat in the back of one of my buddies' yards, watched it on the big projector. And we were all completely convinced Manny Pacquiao had dominated that, and it would be a unanimous decision victory for Pacquiao, as has most everyone I've spoke with who was either at the fight, watched it at home, even the people who watched it many times on replay were convinced Pacquiao had won. Obviously, we all know it was a split decision. Timothy Bradley ended up winning. Dwayne Ford, one of the judges for the fight, who I should say before the fight was considered a very well-respected judge within the sport, he was quoted afterwards as saying, I thought Bradley gave Pacquiao a boxing lesson. He also said, I thought a lot of the rounds were close. Pacquiao missed a lot of punches, and I thought he was throwing wildly. So he watched it, like you said, ringside, and his take on it, walking away from his ringside view, was that not only did Timothy Bradley win, but that he won pretty handily. I don't know what his reaction would be after watching the video many times, but it's a type of thing where if I'm boxing you, Rahim, and I get a couple shots in on you, but they don't phase you, does that mean that I'm not a very hard puncher? You know, we can't measure how hard of a puncher I am, or was it that you have a great chin? It'll never be the type of sport that we can definitively quantify like you can baseball, or I shouldn't even say baseball because of the strike zone, you know, football, basketball. Do you think it is the type of sport that can be improved from the sense of the subjectivity, or will it always be kind of an imperfect, completely subjective sport that opens itself up to this type of controversy?
Well, at the top, let me say that I still think a grand majority of people believe that Pacquiao won that fight, but there is a very loud, very strong minority of people who do watch this fight differently, and that's the subjectivity that we're discussing. They say, okay, watch it on television again with the sound off. You know, most people saw the fight on television. Very few people in, relativity to how many people saw it on total, saw it in person. So watch the fight with the sound off. That changes your perspective. Watch the fight in slow motion. That changes your perspective. Watch these rounds in slow motion, and then count how long during that 3 minutes Pacquiao actually threw punches. Some people say he only fought half of the round. How can you win a round like that? Those are the technological things that I think can be improved. And to, respectfully disagree with one of my idols, Jim Lampley, I think that his generation of fight observers have given up on the improving of the sport. I don't think Lampley responded to my question in the way that he did because he's a purist or because he doesn't want to see anything changed. I think that he's been around so long that he's just accepted the as is what it is, and that's what it's going to be, and it's too many moving parts to effectively change it for the better. I disagree. I think that in all the sports you named, like even baseball, basketball, football, they've all got instant replay. They've all kept up with the times to a certain extent, at least, to eliminate the aspects of their sport that make for controversial endings, because no matter how grand a fight was, and I thought the Pacquiao-Bradley fight was entertaining. No one talks about what a good fight it was. They only talk about what a bad decision they think it was, regardless to what side of the equation they're on. Even those who think that Bradley won and got the victory, they're upset because everyone's giving Pacquiao the credit. And obviously those who think that Pacquiao won think he got robbed. And no one talks about actually a pretty good fight that we saw. So when there's an aspect of the sport that's taking away from the sport that can at this point be easily corrected by something like instant replay. Again, to use your example of the Pacquiao-Bradley decision, you see that fight on television depending on the size of your TV. If you blow it up, you're right. He did miss more punches than you would think, and I was sitting ringside, and I thought that he landed a lot of those punches, and that's why when I walked out of that place, I thought Pacquiao won the fight. Honestly, I still think Pacquiao won the fight, but I didn't think he won it as handily as I had initially assessed it when I got home and watched that thing on HD and saw that a lot of these punches got inside, a lot of these punches breezed right by the cheek, but a lot of those punches didn't land flush. He did enough to win in my assessment, but I believe if you had judges that were watching the fight on television solely, paying no attention to what's in the ring, maybe even in booths like they have them in football, like in a truck somewhere, focused on the television, and still had the ringside judges to be there. You got to hear the punches land, man. There's something about that, the atmosphere. You feel the momentum. You see the fighter wins. You can tell which punches were harder than other punches a lot better, actually, in person than you can on television, because there's something about, like everyone knows, being there physically present as a part of the environment, as a part of the atmosphere, where some of these punches, they send electricity down your spine when they're landed, because that's how electric they are. Well, that kind of thing you really can only experience ringside. So we need to bring the world together. We need to bring the arcane world of the first fights, 1800s, and bring in the 21st century technology that's at our disposal. Boxing, judging, being, if not perfected, improved significantly, I think would improve the respect for the sport from the casual fan. When a young fight fan watches a sport, watches his favorite, watches his stars, and the decision comes around, they can be confident that the decision is going to be fair or at least fairly thought out. And every other sport has found a way to do this. And I think it's time for boxing to do exactly the same thing. The pressure that can be brought to bear for something like that, I think, has to be from the fans. It has to be from the fighters themselves who are cheated the most out of bad decisions. Fighters that, when we do see matchups when it's an incredibly talented fighter and a superstar fighting somebody on the way up, fighting an underdog, and the decision doesn't go their way, either because, as Lampley said, because of politics, because of money, because of, again, the promoter and the network. It's in their best interest to keep their star viable, and to keep a star viable, you got to keep a star winning. Well, again, I think that's the old way of thought. To keep a star viable, keep the sport viable. To keep a star viable, make that win legitimate. Don't have those wins being questioned. Don't have judges that are in your hometown scoring the fight differently than you would score it in his hometown. The advantage of a hometown should be the crowd, not the officials. So let's talk for a minute about what the networks can do if we can convince them that we will tune in more. We will appreciate the sport more. We will spend more money. We will spend more money happily if we see matchups that are consistent with the competitive nature of the sport. There's dozens, hundreds, thousands of talented fighters out there that could develop faster and be quicker on the ascension to stardom if they could get the fights necessary to display their talent. On this clip out, I'm going to actually step outside of the boxing realm to a pioneer that was able to recognize the flaw in this business model of modern boxing, turn it to his advantage by not making the same mistake, and show us what could be if only we would be willing to bring ourselves in the 21st century and look at what's necessary to keep the fans in the seats. Dana White, president of the UFC.
Today. And they asked him about what do you think the biggest problem in the fight business is. He said cable television. These guys that are involved in cable television, they think they're matchmakers, they think they're promoters, they think they want to be fight managers, and they don't know jack about the fight business, but they think they do. That's the problem. I could not agree with Don King more.
No.
There you have Dana White, agreeing with Don King that the cable television networks are kind of the bad guys. Instead of saying that it's Bob Arum against Oscar De La Hoya, who are really poisoning the sport, he's turning it on to HBO and Showtime. Do you think HBO and Showtime deserve the blame for this being, the sport that we love being the imperfect sport, if you will, or is it the promoters?
Well, when you got Don King and Dana White agreeing on something, you probably should take note of what it is, because whatever you think of these guys personally, whatever you think of UFC versus boxing, they both have proven that they know how to sell tickets and they know how to keep fans happy. And Don King has been involved in some of the most scandalous decisions ever in the sport, some of the most scandalous business practices you ever want to research. But at the same time, he's done these things in his best interest and in his own personal best interest. So we can't trust Don King. We can't even trust Dana White, if he were in the position of a Don King, to do everything necessary to keep the sport at its peak prime performance. So what does that require? It requires that everyone recognize and at least a degree of their self-interest is wrapped up in the self-interest of the sport itself. And the major players, the most major players we would have to assess is the networks, because even if the promotion world were to splinter and it wouldn't be so monopolized by the two biggies, the networks are what control the access to the fans worldwide. You only pack so many people into a building, and only so many people are able to attend any given fight in any given city. So the advent of television has brought the private room to the world stage. So the networks, the cable companies, they've got to recognize that there's something that's happening over there in the UFC that's not happening in boxing, and it has nothing to do with the ability of the sport itself to bring excitement to the fans or intrigue to the viewing audience or anticipation to the ticket buyer. It has everything to do with them seeing the matchups that bring those incentives to participating in and supporting the sport to its peak. And I think that their model, again, has been for a long time, we need stars, and who the stars fight are far less important to how often the stars fight and on how big a stage the stars fight. And we can supplement the lack of competition with hype, which is where the promoter comes in, and we just talk about it like it's a really competitive fight. And then you see the fight and you see how this star has dominated, and they've over the last 3 months convinced you that his competition was worthy, and he blows through the competition and you're like, wow, this guy's even better than I thought. But that's a shell game. That's smoke and mirrors. That's not sustainable. That's not going to get you pay-per-view ticket sales or ticket buys every 3 weeks, as the UFC has managed to be, to accomplish. So again, this is not, before you guys go nuts, this is not me saying UFC is better or MMA is better than boxing or anything like this. We're talking business right now. We're talking business models. And I think you'd be a fool to think that the boxing business model as it is current day is outshining the UFC business model. They've clearly got us, by the toes right now. And it's easily, I think, turned around if only those executives at the network would see things differently. And what's that going to require? It requires you that are watching this to write them, call them, email them, vote with your wallet. Don't be willing to shell out the dollars for just any fight that they put in front of you because you know one of the fighters is talented. The pressure has to be applied by demand so that those who are supplying, those who are demanding, have to supply what's demanded. And right now, for all the griping and the belly aching and moaning that we do when we hear a fight announced that ain't exactly what we think it should be, we're not applying that pressure. We're not demanding what should be supplied. And that is what we as fight fans, as journalists, and yes, as fighters themselves, that's where we have a common thread and interest. We've got to unify on that point and make our voices heard. Let me bring in, lastly, Larry Merchant, another Hall of Famer, another guy who's been sitting ringside for ages and can only offer a perspective in the way that Larry Merchant offers perspectives.
Can bring boxing back to the forefront of the American awareness?
Well, there's an interesting contradiction going on. One, there's more live boxing shows on cable television today than there ever have been, like an average of 3 or 4 a week. And two, Mayweather and Pacquiao may not be heavyweights, but in terms of their popularity, in terms of the dollars they generate, they're heavyweights. There are heavyweights. So, things change, and sometimes we get surprised. And, what if a Tiger Woods of heavyweights emerges from somewhere?
And last.
Merchant discusses a couple interesting topics there. He mentions or he references that the welterweight division, by Mayweather and Pacquiao, has kind of, in effect, really been the heavyweight division for us lately. In reality, the real heavyweight division's been dominated for years by a couple brothers who refuse to fight each other and are not Americans. I don't know that the fact that they're not Americans really matters. Do you think the emergence of, like Merchant referenced, a Tiger Woods type figure or someone coming as a heavyweight star or a couple heavyweight stars onto the scene, is that what really could inject, give a shot in the arm to the imperfect sport of boxing?
Kelly, they are not Americans, and that matters.
Okay.
It means everything. And I don't say that as some isolation nationalist. I say that as a fight fan that's been watching the sport since I've been watching TV. And in America, American heavyweight champion is the end-all, be-all. That was our single most adored athlete at any given moment, the American heavyweight champion. And it's unfortunate that these Klitschko brothers, who have undeniably dominated the heavyweight division for years and years and years, maybe a decade by now, are not at all an interest to the American fan. It's just the truth. We don't want to see it. And the reason is because we don't have competition. And this is a great example of two guys that are dominating the sport, and because no one can effectively challenge them, no one cares. No one in America cares. Obviously, in their home country, they're selling buku tickets, but they could walk down the street, right down Hollywood Boulevard here, and probably be noticed by 2 or 3 people, and probably those 2 or 3 people are here visiting from Russia or the Ukraine or Germany. The fact that there is no American heavyweight champion, no matter how great Pacquiao, no matter how great Mayweather or Canelo Alvarez or the next, Adrian Broner, whoever is out there that's not weighing in at 200 plus, they're never going to fill that void. That's never going to happen because there's something about the bone-crushing nature, the two locomotives crashing into each other right there in the middle of the tracks that can't be duplicated, by 2 red wagons, no matter how fast the red wagons are going. So without an American heavyweight, I think that boxing has a very tough struggle. All the things that I've discussed already are important, and they would make a significant difference, but not nearly as significant a difference that could be made if we could again start producing viable American heavyweight fighters that can win, defend, and challenge the crown. That is what captures the American public, and that can happen in an instant. One guy that was able to take the Klitschkos to the brink and cross that line, knock these guys out, finish these guys unequivocally, could bring the kind of attention to boxing that even Mayweather hasn't been able to do in the last 5 years combined. And I truly believe that. And here is why you get an answer like that from a Larry Merchant. Now, the clip, obviously it's a clip. So if you want the full context of the interview, which I think is worth watching, obviously you can find me on Facebook, Radio Rahim, first name Max Boxing, last name, and watch that whole thing. Go on YouTube if you want to and research it, because that's the old hat. Like, that's the old way of thinking. Larry Merchant's got a job. He's still, promoting fights from ringside, if you will, by being hired to call fights. So he doesn't really want to say what we had discussed just before that clip, which is, without a heavyweight champion, it's such a tough struggle that, you can't ever imagine boxing being what it was in its golden era, the Ali, the Foreman, the Frazier, those days, unless you've got those type of fights being made. And, so what we do instead, until guys decide that boxing is more viable than football, boxing is more viable than basketball, that they're going to come into this sport instead of the guaranteed money, guaranteed college education, that's tough to compete with. So in the interim, what we need to do is fix what we've got. What we need to do is put these aspects of reform in place that we've already discussed. I think technology, again, goes a long way in legitimizing the decisions that we see in boxing, making it much easier for the officials, being the referees, if they could take a look and, hey, was that really a knockdown? Hey, did he slip? Was that from a punch? Even Mike Tyson was the victim of a lack of technology. Everyone has seen the Buster Douglas fight. That changed boxing history. Well, guess what? Mike Tyson knocked out Buster Douglas. Technically, if a 10 count is what you need to keep a guy on the mat and get the victory, well, guess he knocked Buster Douglas out for 10 seconds, couldn't get up, but the count was long. With instant replay, history has changed. With instant replay, Buster Douglas never gets off the mat to win that fight. Who knows how boxing or the heavyweight division would be different now if that decision had been correct then. So until we can farm out another generation of heavyweight champions, we've got to be so concise, so motivated, so intent on improving the sport where we actually can make an effective change. And I think another aspect beyond the technological aspect is to broaden the horizons of the sport. You know, we've just seen a fight this last week that took place in China. You know, we've seen fights overseas where we take American fighters over there, put fight fans in the seats in arenas in their home country to see their home fighters fight an American fighter. And that kind of thing makes boxing global again. Boxing, I would have to say, is the only sport where when you've crowned a world champion, you've truly crowned a world champion. It's not a team sport. It's not a league. You don't have to come to America to play. This year, we're gonna crown a world champion of basketball. But guess what? All those champions on that team only played basketball against guys playing on American teams. They don't go around the world to win those championships. Oh, you only see that in the Olympics. I think, you know, football, it's hilarious to me that the major sports, I should say, not all sports, but the major sports, football, basketball, baseball, they all pronounce themselves world champions, but they only play in the States. Only the games in America count. Only American teams are able to compete. Well, boxing, you can come from up under a country, up under a rock in a country that no one has ever heard of, and if you get in the ring and perform, you are indeed the world champion. The challenges come from all over the world. They're one-on-one. So this guy inherently is representing his mother country, and that is where the clash is created. And if you'll remember, a lot of Don King promotions were based on race and nationality, and, you know, maybe now we'd be have a little softer touch than the heavy-handed way, you know, Don King promoted those type of events. But in reality, that's what inspires pride in people. That's what brings people out to support someone that they relate to, that they know the upbringing, that they may have knew as kids, went to the same school as them, from the same country, you know, have the same last name even. That's what gets people who would otherwise not be watching the sport to turn on the TV, to buy the ticket, to buy the pay-per-view. That's one aspect that I think boxing is going in the right direction. But here's another question. You know, we're discussing all of these fights, all of these fixes, all of the options, but what's never discussed is women in the sport of boxing. They're out there too. Is that another viable avenue to create a new generation, a new gender, a new fan? Could women's boxing be something that actually brings more attention to the sport as a whole and be viable? I mean, it's been out for so long. I'd be interested to know, Kelly, I mean, how you feel about that. This is our third show now. It's the first time we've ever brought it up, certainly first time I've ever mentioned it. And, you know, is that, you know, buoy on us? Are we wrong for that?
It's a great question. You know, I'm obviously here in Louisville, Kentucky. My main exposure to women's boxing has been through a couple of the amateur fights I've went to. And to be honest, when the women were fighting during those amateur events, I wasn't paying as close of attention. You know, obviously we have Christy Martin, who became very well popularized through her pairings with Mike Tyson on the pay-per-view events, I believe through the 80s and 90s. So a lot of people got to know her. Here in Louisville, Kentucky, obviously Laila Ali, and nationally, I mean, she was, you know, hats got to go off to her. She went undefeated. She actually knocked Christy Martin out. I could see enjoying a women's boxing match. Just being honest, I never have.
Well, you know, that's fair enough. That's what you got to be honest about. Are enough people enjoying it? And if not, why? And if the people that are enjoying it, what is it about it that they enjoy, and can we increase on that? You know, I'm not at all opposed to women's boxing. I appreciate that they put the same thing on the line that the guys do. I appreciate that getting hit in the face is no fun, whether you're a male or a female. I think that there is in our society a recoiling from seeing that kind of violence with women. Like, you know, we've got it drilled into us, you know, for so long that, hey, you know, the worst thing you can do in the world is beat up a woman if you're a man. And because sports is dominated by male fans, to see women being beat up, something seems wrong about that. Something seems like, yeah, I don't want any parts of that. You know, you've got it, you know, ingrained in your system, if you're any kind of gentleman, that this is not something that I should be viewing. It's not something I should be enjoying. So because of that, we don't even give it a shot. I'm going to take a perspective on this really quickly because I want to get back to that Christy Martin issue. But I want to take a perspective on this and throw it out while we discuss it. I think that for women to really grasp the attention of the American fan, instead of matching what the men are doing, instead of fighting the same kind of fight that you see in men's boxing, where we get our fill of, violence, of competition in a way that we're comfortable with, make them uncomfortable. Go the extra mile. My mother used to tell me, for my place in life, hey, it's not good enough to be good enough. You got to be better just to get what the good are getting. And if you want to get more than that, then you better be the best, right? Well, by that same principle, then push it further.
No gloves. No gloves.
No gloves. You know exactly where I was going, and you know what? To your credit, I did not tell you that beforehand. That's exactly where I'm going. Take the gloves off, not
Literally.
bare knuckle, wrap it with hand wraps. I mean, look, man. If it's true that men are so strong that we got to wear gloves, the impact of the punches is too bone crushing, whatever. Well, women's bones are strong. Women's chins are strong. If you heard that there was going to be a bare knuckle brawl between two women, I think you'd be more likely to tune in than if you were to hear that there was a boxing match going on. I say take it. Push the envelope further. Do more than the men can do. I'll give you one other anecdote, if you will. And it's another one of my favorites. A woman who seeks to be an equal to a man lacks ambition. Do more. Do better. Go further. Challenge the men on their toughness, because I believe that they can. And in this day and age, with the lack of reward that you can get really from being a female fighter, I think the women that do get in there, they do it because they love it in their hearts, because they are true warriors, and they aren't really looking down the road at some pot of gold. It's not likely that you're going to get rich being a female boxer. So if you're in there toughing it out right now as a female fighter, you're a true fighter. I got to give you even more credit than a guy who's at your same age and skill level willing to enter the men's fighting arena, because at least there's some other motivation for him possibly down the road where he may be able to take care of his family and maybe even another generation of his family. If he's really able to dominate, you could be a phenomenal female fighter and you're still living hand to mouth. So chew on that for a little while I revisit the Christy Martin issue, because she is, I would say, one of the only two fighters that had really made any money in the sport to be spoken of. Christy Martin is a great example of someone who didn't have the looks, didn't have all the trappings of intended success, in the sense that she wasn't built up and made the fan made comfortable with her and then put on the stage as, hey, here's a great talent. No, Don King pulled this diamond out of the rough, put her on an undercard of a Tyson fight. No, most of the people that tuned into the Tyson fight didn't even know that there was going to be a female on the card, but she came out and she was a brawler. She was gritty. It was the coal miner's daughter. People, again, related to that, and that means everything. When they saw her scrapping and, blood on her face, and she was willing to go at it, again, taking it to that next level. She wasn't out there boxing, trying to be cute about it. She was out there brawling, and people appreciated it. And kind of like seemingly out of nowhere, you had this star that was born. And to give her credit, throughout her career, she has gone about it in a way that I think the sport of boxing as a whole should go about its career. And that's taking the fights, taking the matchups. Like you said, she did get knocked out by Laila Ali, but way more important than the fact that she got knocked out is the fact that she took the Laila Ali fight. That's what makes her medal. Okay. So what attracted Christy Martin to the sport? And we're talking about there's no real financial incentive for a woman to be in boxing in 2013. Well, what the hell was the financial incentive in '86 or when Martin came on the stage? Let her answer that question for herself.
Who are these women?
I think people saw me in the pink and they thought, it's two women fighting, she's gonna quit. Now she's bleeding, she's gonna quit. And I just tried to fight harder. I didn't want people to see me as a quitter or a bleeder or whatever. I wanted to see me as a winner.
To have a boxer on the cover. Christy Martin did reach a lot of fans that not many women boxers or not any women boxers really have been able to reach because of, like I referenced earlier, really her partnership almost with Mike Tyson on so many pay-per-view cards and events. She hasn't fought in almost 2 years now. Laila Ali doesn't seem like she's lacing up the gloves anymore either. Where does the sport go from here? Is it, I mean, I don't see any stars on the horizon, at least not that I know of.
Well, I think, again, the sport, it's got to change. It's got to change. And I expect some of those ardent women's boxing fans to be offended by this. I understand why they'd be offended by this. Why do we have to change? Why do we have to be different? Well, you have to be different because you are different, and what you're doing is not working. And just like we've got things to fix on the male side of the sport, if we're going to stay alive, we're going to stay viable, if we're going to go into this 21st century as one of the major sports in the world, we got to make changes. Well, guess what? If you're going to get into the 21st century as even a consideration for a major sport, you're going to have to make some tweaks, and they're not all going to be small. I think that you've got to come at this thing with a different mindset. Now, why I thought that Chrissy Martin clip was significant was because she said ultimately how I'm seen. I want to be seen as a winner. And right now, women in boxing are not seen as winners, they're seen as women. And for however unfair or unjust it is, in sports, being seen as a woman is not something that fans want to pay to see women do. You don't want to pay to see women do something. You want to pay to see winners do something. You want to pay to see fighters fight. You want to pay to see players play. And if you're paying, if you're having in your mind that you're watching women play basketball, not basketball players playing basketball, if you have in your mind that you're watching women fight and not winners fight, fighters fight, warriors fight, then you're not going to attribute to the sport and the athletes the respect that they deserve. So when you have a Laila Ali who came into the sport obviously with every advantage you could possibly imagine a female fighter coming into the sport with, she's got the unreasonably advantage of name recognition. Okay, you've got the best resource of knowledge in the sport in your family, your immediate family. Your father's Muhammad Ali. Okay, just the idea that you would even talk about stepping in the ring is going to bring interest from networks, promoters, fans. Hey, that's something that is interesting, but not because you're Laila, but because your dad is Muhammad. So we're still piggybacking off of the men to make something of a sideshow for the women. And as long as it's seen that way, as long as it's still a sideshow, something other than boxing, it will never be as successful as I think it should be, and it will never get the respect I believe it deserves. So I wanted to contrast the way Martin saw her role in boxing and why she saw boxing as an avenue for her to go with, who came from nothing, a coal miner's daughter, right? There are no famous coal miners that I'm aware of. And, she wasn't even coal mining. So she came literally from nothing, and Don King put her on the stage and she attracted the attention and grasped the imagination of the boxing fans for a time. Well, Laila Ali, again, was able to do that simply by dropping her name on the program. So let's talk now. Let's see the difference in how Laila Ali perceived her role as we just heard Chrissy Martin explain hers.
When I first saw women's boxing on television for the first time, I was just, how did I not know women box? How did I not know about this until now? Because I never wanted to be a fighter just by watching my dad. It wasn't an option to me until I actually saw women fighting, and I instantly wanted to do it, and I instantly felt like I could be a champion.
Laila Ali is Muhammad Ali's daughter. The reason that he was the most popular face, arguably on the planet at times, was because he was a great fighter. Laila Ali was famous because of that. She didn't know that women's boxing existed. I mean, if there's something that's more indicative of the lack of exposure women's boxing gets, I don't know what it is, if it's not that Laila Ali didn't even know it exists. She said she saw Christy Martin fight. She was then inspired to get into the sport. What's your take on that? I
would agree wholeheartedly. The takeaway from that was that Laila Ali didn't know women's boxing existed. And to this day, most people don't know women's boxing still exists. The only reason that anyone knows that it ever existed was because of Christy Martin and Laila Ali. And interestingly enough, she says, hey, she watched Christy Martin fight, and that inspired her to get in the ring. And then ultimately, she ended up fighting Christy Martin. But I would say that if there's a knock on Laila Ali, it's the same as what we've discussed with men fighting as superstars and not fighting matchups as gritty competitors, in the sense that Christy Martin fight was one in which Laila Ali was certainly the favorite. She had more skills. Christy Martin arguably had more grit, or at least that's what she was known for, her grit. Never was it her boxing skill set. It was that she was willing to lay it all on the line. And again, I'm going to remind you about taking off the gloves and putting on the hand wraps, because that was the most exciting aspect of women's boxing ever. Even more so, I believe, than Laila Ali was Christy Martin, because, you stop thinking of her as a woman, and that doesn't take anything away from her femininity, but it took that crossover to stop thinking of I'm watching a woman and I'm watching a fighter. Like, she's laying it on the line. She's bloody faced. She's not backing up. She's not worried about being cute. She's not worried about the things that I think women worry about. She wants to win this fight, and she's in there to warrior and wage war for every minute of every round. And once that happens, that supersedes all. That is what gains the respect. Laila Ali learned how to box. She really did. She had the greatest teacher at her resource, no question. She also had all the money in the world that you could, use to hire and be in the right gyms and eat right and all of that stuff. She had plenty of time to think about it. She had a stage set for her right out of the gate, so she took a path that was most advantageous to her career. And in these two fighters, we see the different ways you can go. So if there's a knock on Laila Ali, it's that I believe that when the time came for the Pacquiao Mayweather type of fight, it didn't happen. And in my assessment, it didn't happen because Laila Ali refused to allow it to happen. Now, why she refused, I can't impart to you the thinking, what's in her mind or what's in her heart. I won't try. But what I will say is that fight could have been made, and it wasn't made. And the fight that I'm talking about is Laila Ali versus Ann Wolfe. Ann Wolfe has never gotten the type of fanfare or the world stage that was presented to Christy Martin by Don King. She certainly never got the magazine covers and ESPN interviews and red carpet walks that Laila Ali entered the sport with. But what she did have was grit and ability and a desire to win and a warrior's heart. So those fans that were attracted to women's boxing when Laila Ali became a star started to become aware of this Ann Wolfe fighter that was knocking women out left and right. That again, I'm not calling anybody unattractive, but she wasn't concerned. That wasn't a part of her promotional makeup. Her whole deal was knocking people out. I'm from the streets. I'm all this fanfare, whatever. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here to hurt you in the ring. And so she was very easy to cross over from, the way you think of women, and this is a women, women's playing or women fighting, but it's not really fighters fighting. Well, Ann Wolfe dispelled that, incorrect assessment in the first minute of the first round usually. So the matchup became kind of like, okay, well, if Laila Ali is supposed to be all that, but she's just knocking out girls I never heard of, well, I've heard about this Ann Wolfe. Why doesn't she fight Ann Wolfe? And then as Laila Ali's career persisted and Ann Wolfe continued to knock out opponents, unapologetically and viciously, as far as women's boxing goes, it was the equivalent, I would say, of the Pacquiao-Mayweather desire. Like, it was the most desired fight at one time by people who follow women's boxing, to see Ann Wolfe and Laila Ali step in the ring. So I don't think we could discuss this topic without giving Ann Wolfe a chance to explain for herself how I think women's boxing went off the tracks when they could have been headed to the station, and it hasn't gotten back on track since. let Ann Wolf explain why, in her estimation, that fight didn't happen, and in my estimation, why women's boxing has never returned to the fast track it was on for a brief time when Laila Ali was dominating the sport.
Like Muhammad Ali's daughter, she's a coward. She ran and hid. She hid behind people she knew she could beat, but she won't take on a true warrior because she's afraid to fail. So she'll never, ever, ever be a real champion. When you're afraid to fall, how can you stand if you're afraid to fall? It's impossible.
Two-time lightweight champion of the world.
Ann's career coincided with that of Muhammad Ali's daughter, Laila. Laila Ali earned millions in the ring and became one of the first female boxers to gain celebrity status. Despite the fact that Ann publicly challenged her on numerous occasions, the bout boxing fans wanted to see.
Rahim, what you can see there is, like you described, she's tough. She's from the streets. Arguably maybe like a Mike Tyson-esque figure for women's boxing. She didn't finish her career undefeated. You know, if we're going to draw a parallel, and it's tough to do, but maybe Laila Ali was maybe a little more like Floyd Mayweather. She avoided taking some tough fights, but she did finish with that perfect record, and she knocked out Christy Martin, who's known as at least maybe the most popular fighter in the history of the sport. Was Laila Ali good for the sport of boxing, or did she really corrupt it at the end?
Well, I mean, no, she didn't corrupt it, but she got out of boxing what she wanted for herself, but she did not do for the sport what it did for her. She did not return to boxing what she was able to extract from boxing, and that was the world's attention. If you take that fight, what does it matter that she retired undefeated? It doesn't matter, because no one knows anyone she fought except for Christy Martin. No one remembers any names that she fought. And when I say no one, again, I'm talking about the casual female fans, the casual fans of female boxing, and those fans who haven't returned to female boxing since Laila Ali. They were just getting somewhere. And the reason you remember Christy Martin is because that was competitive. That was the one time when you were like, oh, wow, this could get real. Like, okay, the slugger, the brawler, the one who leaves it all in the ring versus the boxer, the polished, the star, that clash happens. And even though technically it would have been pretty easy to assess early on that Laila Ali was going to outbox her and have too many skills for Christy Martin to deal with. Not only that, but obviously Christy Martin was a lot further along in her career, older, had more of a challenge facing Laila than Laila had facing Christy. So it wasn't that necessarily the fight was so hard to predict that Laila would win, but it showed that we could see in the ring two women that were willing to fight each other, and their backstories made for an interesting a clash. It could have gone either way. It could have been Christy Martin's victory, and that alone was enough for it to stand out in history. This Ann Wolf fight could have taken women's boxing to the next level, and I don't blame Laila Ali solely. Of course, it's all a machine. I'm sure that there's people in her ear. I'm sure that, hey, at the time it seemed undefeated was the most important thing, and you're on the magazine covers, and why would I put myself in harm's way for this woman who's relatively little known when I can still get all the accolades and not face her? And that's how fighters think now. That's how some superstar fighters think now. But it would have been better not just for Ann Wolf, who was denied the opportunity to show that she could compete with a Laila Ali and could possibly have knocked out an undefeated fighter who was at the time the biggest star in her sport. But she denied the fans the opportunity to say, see, this is what it's all about. And Laila Ali never had one of those, this is what it's all about fights. So for all that she was able to acquire from the sport, and for the spotlight that she did put on the sport, and you can't take that from her, and you can't take that from Christy Martin. They were the only two to put a significant spotlight on the sport. I think the fatal flaw in all involved was to not make the competitive fights that were they were actually people calling for a female fight. Like, that is a whole nother level unto itself. That means you just reached another pinnacle of success. That means that there's actually some fervor out there and people are calling to see something. How can you not give it to them? Especially at that stage of development. How do you not make that fight happen? And the proof in the pudding, because I believe women's boxing, the fan base is so much smaller, I'll call it a microcosm of what's wrong with the macro stage of boxing. It's that same dynamic. They didn't make that fight happen, and since then, no one's ever called for a female fight in significant numbers. You haven't heard anyone ever say, oh, yeah, I would love to see these two females fight. I can't wait for them to make that fight happen. Since Ali Wolf didn't happen, no one's ever wanted another female fight to happen in significant numbers. So that, I think, is the question that you have to put to yourself in the sport of boxing as a whole. Are we willing to put the fights in the ring at the time that the fans want to see them with the fighters that are best prepared to put on the most competitive fight and reach the 21st century, not only technologically with the advancements that we have at our disposal to make the fight more concisely called, more better refereed, more accessible to the fans when it comes to knowing that things are not corrupt, knowing that there's a way to look beyond objectivity or subjectivity to something objective. We've got to start to have something to point to that is not in dispute. Everything about boxing is always in dispute because we recoil from anything definitive other than a knockout. I think that that's hurting the sport. So for those watching, first of all, let me say that I love the fact that you guys do get out there, you comment when you see the video, you email, you let us know what you think. These are two topics that I want to hear from you. Laila, I'd like to hear your suggestions. What do you think brings boxing into the 21st century? Because believe me, it's not going away. It's not dying. The question is, how vibrant a life are we going to live? On how big a stage are we going to be able to continue to put forward the sport that we all love? So let us know. Let us know what you think the fixes are in the sport. And, you're welcome to say, hey, man, shut up, man. There's nothing wrong with the sport. And the way it is the way it has always been. And that's the way it always should be. I'm welcome, you're welcome to make that case. And secondly, I would like to know, almost yes or no. Do you think, what's the future of women's boxing? Does it have a future? Is it something that you'd want to see? Is it something that you could be made to want to see if you made the changes like I'm talking about, or if you have your own? Stay involved with us. Stay active. You guys have been great about doing that. It inspires me. It inspires Kelly. We get on and we hear from you, and it influences our show. So, what we do on Sunday Punch is really a lot predicated on what you say Monday through Saturday. So, Kelly, as usual, I am so happy to be out in Louisville with you. I can't get off air without congratulating you guys on heading to the championship game. I'm not a big basketball fan, but I did watch the games yesterday, and they were phenomenal, and you guys did really well, and I'm hoping, that you win it and I guess cut down those nets.
Thank you very much, Rahim. It's been a great show. I want to encourage, like Rahim said, everybody comment in the YouTube comment section. We'd love to hear what you have to say. We talk about it. Rahim and I talk during the week. I want to encourage you also, obviously, to join us next weekend for more Sunday Punch.